So some of you may know that in New Hampshire, they have what's called the 4400 Club. And in the 4400 Club, you basically have to climb 45 of their mountains that are 4,500 feet and above. And in 2013, one of my friends only had to do 4 left. Out of the 45, she only had 4 left. And she was going to do it in one sitting. And she decided to go on a 2-day hike, 26 miles, ascending and descending, 4 different peaks. And just to go the extra mile, she decided to do it in spring, which means that she had to deal with snow and she had to deal with ice. And so she had to wear not only a backpack for the overnight, but she had to switch between her snowshoes and her microspikes because of the snow and ice. The day before her hike, she went down to go visit some friends in Boston. And they were celebrating, and then at one point they decided to go into the square. And but then she got disoriented because, you see, she got separated from her friends because bombs started going off. The day before her hike was the Boston Marathon bombing. And at this point, she had to make a choice. She could either run back to her friend's house, which was 7 blocks behind Copley Square, but on this day, she decided that going the extra mile was going to be different. So she decided that someone was probably going to need her help, so she moved into the square. And sure enough, as she moved into the square, she found this mother, and she was crying hysterically because her son was on the ground, his body devastated by the bombs. And my friend said to the mother, I'm a nurse at a junior high school, can I help? And, there are going to be occasions in our life where we need to make choices. And our passage today, Hebrews 13, 1-3, is on brotherly love. And so the main question that we want to answer is, how does brotherly love inform our decisions? And as a part of that, we'll see how hospitality and prison visitation is connected to that. So let's start off right from the beginning. Hebrews 13:1 reads this way, but let brotherly love continue. And when we first hear it, it's a very awkward statement, right? Let brotherly love continue. So we think about maybe the context might help us out a little bit here. And, first we have to realize that the book of Hebrews is actually an epistle. And New Testament epistles, they have a theological component, and they also have an application part. And our chapter 13 actually begins the application part of the letter. And so it wouldn't surprise us if we looked at the Greek that the verbs in these 3 verses are in the imperative form. And what that means is that they're actual commands. So let brotherly love continue. It still sounds awkward because it sounds like a reminder. But when we take a look at the main verb, which is meno, we're very familiar with it because Jesus actually uses it in John 15. It's the same verb when he says, remain in my love, remain in me. And so really this passage could be retranslated as remain in brotherly love, and that completely makes more sense as a command. But it still sounds awkward. It still sounds like a reminder. Like, why is he reminding the Jews in the New Testament times about brotherly love? Don't they know it? So remember that the question that we're asking is, how does brotherly love influence or inform our decisions? And so he moves on, the writer of Hebrews moves on to the second verse, where he says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing them, you have entertained angels unawares. And so he does connect brotherly love with hospitality. And so the question here is, what's the connection? So we need to remember that these are Jews living in New Testament. They're living under the Roman Empire, as opposed to the Old Testament times where it was a nomadic culture. And in nomadic culture, you have people moving from side to side, location to location. So they needed hospitality. Was a staple of that culture. And at that time, hospitality looked like you basically had a water jug by the entrance of your tent for foot washing. You prepared water and bread every day, ready to give out to strangers. And you even had to give out, it was kind of by default, you had to give strangers to the animals of the people walking by or going by. But this phrase of entertaining angels unawares is a complete allusion to Abraham. And since this is a letter being written to the Jews, they would get that reference. And when we take a look at Abraham's story, We note that, the strangers come into his tent and he's like, oh, let me get you some water. Why don't you sit by the tree and let me make you a meal? So he turns to his servant and he says, can you please prepare a calf for our guests? And, I don't know about you, if you had a chance to have turkey dinner this past Thanksgiving, but cooking a turkey doesn't take an hour, This was not a peanut butter and jelly sandwich type of meal he was making. I remember growing up, my mom used to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to start basting the turkey. And we would have dinner at 1 o'clock. And I used to love waking up to the smell of turkey. But that's a 6-hour preparation time for a 30-minute turkey. But here's Abraham saying to his servant, go prepare a calf. You see, he's going the extra mile. He's going the distance of hospitality to meet the needs of his guests. This is an all-day affair. And I would also defer actually to Lot. In Lot's story, he lived in Sodom for some time, and he was in the square, and all of a sudden these strangers come in, and he walks up to them and says, well, what are you doing here? And where are you staying? Like, we're actually going to stay in the square. And he says, well, you can't stay in the square overnight. It's dangerous. And the scripture actually said that he pleaded with them 3 different times to stay with him instead. Brotherly love through hospitality is really about proactively looking out for the needs of others. And so what about the next thing? The Hebrew writer then starts talking about prison, and he says in verse 3, remember the prisoners as though in prison with them, and those who are ill-treated, since you yourselves are in the body. And the New Testament does give us some indication of what being in prison was like. The book of Acts tells us that Paul was bounded in his hands, he was bounded in his feet, and sometimes he was even bounded by a prison guard. The conditions were horrible in prison at that time. And the only way you can get food or water is if you had a friend or family member come by to give you food. But the passage also talks about, suffering along those as if you were in prison with them. And so does that mean that in order to show brotherly love, that we need to go to prison to understand what it's like? A few years ago, I actually used to struggle with jealousy. I was always jealous of my sister because, number one, she was younger, but she did a lot of things before me. She got married before I did. She had her first child before I did, and she did a lot of other things before I did. And I was constantly jealous. But in my own jealousy, I was bounded in my personal prison in my soul because of my sin. And not only that, but I was also bounded by my prison guard, shame, in reminding me that I loved my desires more than I loved God. And that whole experience in itself was a prison. But prison isn't just about being in a cell or being spiritually in a cell, but it can be different things for different people. And for like that woman that was in that Copley Square, her son, she was tormented in her own pain by seeing her son body devastated. And for some people, a prison is a physical ailment. This reminds me of the story of the paralytic, and that there's different gospels that talk to that. And one of the things that we see in that is the fact that here are the friends. They're completely aware of their need of their friend who's paralyzed because he's fully aware, fully awake, and alert, but he can't move his body. And so that in and of itself is like a prison. But his friends, they know the need of their friend, but they also hear that Jesus is in town and he's preaching. And they realize that he can release this man, their friend, from their physical ailment. So they go the extra mile by putting him on a stretcher, walking him across town to get to the house where Jesus is preaching. But you see, they come across a roadblock because the front of the house is blocked by the mob trying to get in and trying to listen to Jesus. But they are fully aware that the man inside that house is the same man that the Hebrew writer says, but Jesus sustains the universe with the power of his word. And they also realize that this is the same man that said, but don't you remember the ravens? They don't have storehouses, but I take care of them. How much more will I take care of you? And so they know that if they get this man to Jesus, he will understand his need and absolutely have the power to release him from his prison. So they go the extra mile by raising him up to the top of the house, making a circle in the ceiling, and then lowering him down. They went the extra mile to do everything that they could to get him to the man that could release him from his prison. And so, this is my favorite part of the story, because as they're lowering him down, they look up to Jesus. Jesus looks up to the friends, and he sees, Matthew 9 says, he notices the faith of their friends, and then he turns to the paralyzed man and he says, be encouraged today, because your sins are forgiven. Now get up and walk. And in that moment, we realize that there's a special connection between when we serve others in their needs and we go that extra mile. It's like we're serving Jesus up in heaven, is what Matthew 25 says. When he says, when you feed me, when I'm hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you came to visit me. There's a special connection when we look out for the needs of others. And so brotherly love, it's about proactively looking out for the needs of others. It's about suffering alongside with them. This is the connection between hospitality and prison visitation. But what about us? How do we think about these things? Perhaps are we aware of the needs of our friends, our family? Perhaps one of our family members is having marital explosions and then they're on the brink of divorce. Or perhaps one of our friends has lost their job and they don't know how they're going to pay rent for the next 3 months. Are we going to be reminded then? But don't forget the ravens. How do we remind their brotherly love? Maybe the cafeteria aide is in need of help. That we are aware of these people, the stranger in particular, as well. And what about our own sins? What are some of the sins that are keeping us from brotherly love? Some of us may be struggling with gossip, or maybe we're slandering people behind their back. Some people are struggling with having extramarital affairs or lusting over people. How are these things hindering us from brotherly love? I'm going to leave us with John 15 passage, first saying that, the Hebrew writer reminds us, remain in brotherly love. But Jesus says, remain in me, remain in my love. And he ends that section with, love your neighbor as yourself. Thanks.
Good, David.